Hello, everyone. Welcome to 15 Minutes with Judi. I'm Judi Platz, Chief Customer Officer at Support Logic. And today I'm honored to have with me Stela Koleva from Muse. Stella is with Muse as the Vice President of Customer Experience Services. And prior to that, a long run at an amazing company, SAP Concur. Thrilled to have been a part of the SAP journey for years. And one of my favorite individuals actually still works there, leading support, Mohammed Ajuz. He was my mentor for many years in the industry. Stella, thank you. Let's talk about your journey a little bit, if you don't mind. You have had an amazing time in your career, and you've seen so much evolve from years ago until where we are today. And being focused on customer experience, if there's one thing that's always been true for you in customer experience, what would you say that is?
The customer experience world is very exciting, and it is exciting mostly because it's full of contradictions. That has been in the past, and this is today, where when you think of support, for example, there is AI, there is automation, there is this constant push today to automate, to become faster and self-serve, remove the human from the customer. And the most successful the companies with the best support are the ones who find ways to stay human. Then we look at transactional support, and yet the best companies are the ones who build strong relationships. So there is this constant tension and this constant contradiction where in so many other parts of organizations you can focus on grow linearly. In support and by extension in CX, you have to always find a way to be a transformational leader and find a way to stay really connected with the customers, no matter how small, no matter how far away, no matter their languages. And I personally find this very exciting. And probably these are the two most attractive parts of being a CX leader, working with amazing teams to deliver something that nobody thought it would happen just because it's so contradictory, and at the same time being so close to our customers and really getting to know them and understand them, even though the expectation is would be so transactional in the way we function.
Absolutely. I love that because you're right. There is always a friction, right? And sometimes the friction is certainly internal when you think about the way the teams have to get along with each other, right? Whether it's our sales or our customer success teams or product and engineering. But then there's just the natural friction of what our teams are supposed to do and how they're supposed to do them and balancing that demand, like you said, AI or personal or both. And how do you do that? Because at the end of the day, the customer is still a human being on the other side, right? Who is seeking that support and assistance. I love that answer. Thank you. You have built some amazing teams over the years, and I follow a lot of your updates on LinkedIn. And I love the passion that you bring to your role. And it's always evident in the posts that you make and such that the team matters to you and the people that do the work for those customers we just talked about. It matters to you. So tell me, in building your teams, what have you found you must have to create that culture? And what are you doing to 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 have the impact on the people around you? And let's be real, right? We know the basic stuff, but to be a leader that people want to be with and want to follow, and don't be shy. Tell me what you do to make those people feel good in their roles and to build that culture of, I want to work with Stella and I want to stay with Stella.
Thank you. As we've spoken before, my leadership journey was bumpy and full of learning experiences. I did start in my leadership role. My first leadership role was exactly 13 years ago as a supervisor of a huge team of 3 people. And within 3.5 years, I found myself overseeing 300 employees in a director role. So I was I barely knew how to run a team meeting, and I found myself having to run all hands and having to lead people who were way more experienced than me, who were way more, in certain ways, they could bring so much more to the table. And that is always very intimidating, especially as you enter as a female leader, probably a little bit more. And this is when I learned, hopefully not the very hard way, that the most important thing to do as a leader is to focus on what is the value that you bring to your team. Really understand what is important for each of the team members. And I know that sounds probably basic, but when you really listen, when you learn, that is probably one of the reasons people would stay with you because they know that you can bring value, whether this is by learning from you, whether that is by having opportunities and so on. In my last role in SAP, I had a challenge, the opportunity to serve as the country director for the Conquer Czech business, which was around 550 employees based in our Prague office. And this was very interesting and very educational and brought me that second lesson of the importance of diversity, and the importance of just combining talent and see what happens. We had amazing innovation coming when you would put support employees and developers in one room at a hackathon and leave them to find a solution. There was just so much innovation coming from those teams. Even we won the Hasso-Plattner Innovation Award in 2020. That innovation came from a small Conquer Prague team. And you can imagine how big SAP is, those 130,000 employees. So the ability, the difficult to learn ability to find the best in diverse teams, it probably sounds a little bit cheesy, but in reality, it's just so critical to the success of any team.
I don't think it sounds cheesy. I think that often it's getting back to the basics, right? And people forget about that because they look for the new and innovative ways to lead or manage or challenge their teams. But what you just said there, you created the atmosphere where people would collaborate with each other and they would come up with innovation. I just had the experience to sit with somebody while I was on a business trip. And it was amazing to see in their particular call center how, if you will, rigid it was and how managed to the metrics it was. And you could tell that spirit of innovation or, hey, we could do it different, we could do it better. It wasn't there. You could feel it in the room
That's
because
right.
people knew I'm here to do this. And if I come up with ideas or, as you said, innovations, they didn't have that ability to speak up and say it. Nothing cheesy about what you just said. I think that openness to experiment and try, everybody should take a step back and say, do I have that culture? You might think you do, but are the ideas flowing in, right? Are people sending the Slack saying, hey, could we do this? Could we try that? Could we? And if you don't feel that you're getting those suggestions in the suggestion box, maybe take that breath and look around and see if you have the culture that you just spoke of. Because I think, again, nothing cheesy about it. I think it's a perfect thing that you just said.
But this is combining so beautifully those two questions you just asked, because the comment you made about friction and how we have to be comfortable with friction and innovation is just so critical. Nowadays, support is still a cost center. The companies look at cutting costs, reducing their staff, and you don't have time to innovate. You, even if you want to, your best employees just don't have time to think outside of the box. And that slack that you have to create as an organization is just missing in so many organizations. And this is where you miss out on creating long-term value as a business.
Yeah, for sure. So tell me something. You went from a support background and now you're managing that entire CX, right? CX services. That's a big adjustment, I think, for a lot of individuals because, as you said, support is used to operating in a certain box, right? Where the call center, where the ticket in, ticket out, where the cost center that is, looked at as high expense sometimes. What do you do besides close tickets? And that's why a lot of organizations are so metrics driven, because that's how they can justify, right, their existence and show the steadiness or the improvements that they're making in metrics. But you and I both know support is so much more than that. What is the biggest adjustment you had to make as a leader? And I think for anybody who's listening to us and they're thinking of that next step in their career, I'm in support, but I want to do more. I want to add services. I want to add customer success. I want to add more about the customer experience. What's the one thing that you had to do to make that transition work for you?
Probably because my background is a little bit more diverse. Actually, my first leadership role was as in professional services, in consulting specifically, and then suddenly came call centers, so what we used to have in Concord, the user support desk. Again, exactly very metric driven, whereas in consulting, you usually have more time to innovate. You try to break the rules all the time, and then you suddenly find yourself overseeing these very opposite teams. Probably the one first big lesson for me was learning to respect equally both and find ways to take the lessons learned from one side of the business and find ways to explain and get them adopted in a different side. So if you come to consulting business with very rigid requirements on the typical call center metrics, for example, you would usually face resistance. But if there is something from the call center that the consulting business can try out and vice versa, and that's the tiny first win, I found it was actually very interesting to see the way the success that would bring and how much more understanding and respect you would get between those different teams. So from very early on as a leader, I had to learn to balance those contradicting environments, those contradicting KPIs, and how do I find ways to teach those teams to collaborate the best is probably what brought success to both teams equally. For any leader who'd try to take a jump and expand their responsibilities, probably that would be the first thing to focus on. What are the lessons learned? What are the successes that you can easily implement from one team to another? And how can you foster the collaboration between the teams? Very often, when those teams report into different leaders, we just end up with silos, a little bit of ping pong, a little bit of hot potatoing, etc. So that opportunity to bring and build that collaboration, that mutual respect, is something that I found works beautifully. And something that I'm still working on is building that narrative of success. Very often, when we look at support, for example, again, we look at numbers, there is always the expectation that support has to justify itself with its KPIs. But what if we look at the leaders in the organization and even outside, and the way those leaders learn, the way they read information, and we build the right narrative for them a day in support's life. How does this specific expert role looks like? How does this specific QA person's day looks like? And finding the ways to make that learning tangible, to really build that complete picture, is something that I think very often we forget. We think that executives only talk in numbers, and there is just so much about the picture, the full picture, that we are just not giving to executives, and this is where they only see what we show them. So finding that narrative, I think, is probably the one lesson that I'm still working on myself.
I love that, though. The narrative is so important because left to their own, people will come up with their own narratives and they'll make that narrative the truth. Where if we can be better storytellers and take them on that journey, like you said, a day in the life even of certain individuals and what it is they're doing, I think that's so important. And I love that you're willing to freely admit, I'm still getting better at this. I'm still working on this because I think in support, I was just having this conversation as well. We are case in, case out, right? I see a case, I kill a case, and we move on. And we lose that spirit, I think, of honestly appreciating and celebrating the things that we actually do. And so we fall back to the metrics reporting. And yet, in truth, there are so many beautiful moments that are created by support people or by customer success people, but we're wired to fix those things. And we're just wired to move on to the next hazard, if you will. We're not wired to high five each other and take that moment because it's not actually how we work. And so when we don't do that enough, we lose that ability to find those stories and look for those stories and tell those stories because sometimes it's those 30-minute commercials that are on television that touch us the most, right? I've cried over more commercials in my life than other things because it takes 30 seconds. They grab you and they touch you deeply. And I think we should be really good at those commercials as leaders in our industry. I think it matters.
Exactly that moment to stop and think, even when the world around us is on fire. And support, for example, is so much about firefighting. The world of CSM is so difficult today. As a customer success manager, you find yourself working on maybe support issues, doing a little bit of consulting, and at the same time, for example, you're still measured on upsell targets. There is just so much contradiction, and very often we just default to what we believe everybody else wants to see. But unless you stop, as you said, yes, the world is on fire, the world is going to be on fire in 30 minutes, regardless of what we do. I think this is just so critical and it's just so often forgotten.